Good evening. I'm Mike Perry. I'm the president of the Army Heritage Center Foundation. Foundations is the Friends Group for the U.S. Army Heritage Education Center, a museum archives educational complex affiliated with the Army War College at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The center is one of the premier centers for the research on the history and heritage of the U.S. Army and its soldiers. Tonight, we're pleased to have Dr. Beth Bailey back for a second time. She was one of our early webinars back in the COVID era, back in 2020. So we're glad to have her back. Dr. Bailey is the Foundation Distinguished Professor Director for the Center of Military, War, and Society Studies, and a member of the History Department at the University of Kansas. She is the author or co-editor of 12 books, including America's Army, Making the All-Volunteer Force, Understanding the U.S. Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Managing Sex in the U.S. Military, and Beyond Pearl Harbor, A Pacific History. She has twice received the Army Historical Foundation's Distinguished Writing Award, with Cambridge University Alan Preston. She has co-edited the Cambridge University's book series on military, war, and society in the modern United States. Professor Bailey received the Samuel L. Morrison Prize from the Society of Military History in 2022, and she is currently a Carnegie Foundation Fellow. I'd ask you to please hold your questions to the end. At this time, Dr. Bailey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate it. It's wonderful to have a chance to be back here. And it's a real pleasure to have a chance to talk about my new book that just came out from the University of North Carolina Press. It's called An Army Afire, How the U.S. Army Confronted Its Racial Crisis in the Vietnam Era. And what I've discovered over time is that as a historian, I'm really drawn to looking into how people have tried to solve problems, how they define the problems, why they care about them, the kind of solutions they propose, how they define success. And in the late 1960s, as the U.S. war in Vietnam continues, the U.S. Army is facing a major problem that goes well beyond that war. By 1968, the U.S. Army was afire. Flames had ignited in soldiers' barracks and bars, found fuel in the Army's own policies and practices, caught fire in thousands of confrontations, large and small. Some burned brief, others flared out of control. And by the cusp of the 1970s, race was tearing the Army apart. In Fort Hood, Alabama, August 1968, 43 Black soldiers refused orders to stand by for riot duty at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. One of them explained his actions. He said, "The people we're supposed to control, the rioters, are probably our own race. We shouldn't have to go out there and do wrong to our own people." 9,000 miles away, in war-ravaged Vietnam, at that same moment, 200 Black prisoners seized control of the Army jail at Long Binh. They burned buildings to smoldering embers. They beat guards and fellow prisoners. They repurposed Army blankets into makeshift dashikis, and they improvised African drums, claiming an African space for themselves. They occupied the stockade for weeks. In Nielingen, West Germany, 2 white soldiers stabbed 3 Black soldiers to death. At Fort McClellan, Alabama, someone called the commander's office to warn that Black soldiers who were meeting off post were heading back to, quote, burn it down. Another man called a few minutes later. He said, "When the riot starts, tell Colonel Hip we're going to turn the weapons on him. Black power baby, Ho Chi Minh." An Army major in Saigon, a man with an Army Commendation Medal and a Bronze Star, released an 8-page statement to the press in Saigon, claiming that the U.S. Army was, quote, the strongest citadel of racism on the face of the earth. His claims ran in newspapers nationwide, and the editors of the New York Times positioned that story next to an article about an older African-American couple who had received news that their son was missing in combat in Vietnam. On the same day, they got the letter from a wife of another son who was a soldier stationed in Germany. She wrote that they couldn't find housing there because of their race, and the Army wouldn't do anything to help. Tensions continued to rise. In 1970, at Fort Carson, Colorado, a white soldier who was working part-time as a filling station attendant, that's another story, killed the head of a Black Studies program at a local university. That sparked a confrontation between 35 MPs and 150 Black soldiers who were armed with handguns and a stash of M1 carbines. At Dong Tam Base Camp in Vietnam's Mekong Delta, They struggled with, quote, roving gangs of Black soldiers who were attacking white soldiers at random. And at fire support base Buttons, close to the Cambodian border, a few dozen Black soldiers debated how to, quote, force whitey to pay attention to the Blacks, end quote, without injuring anyone. They destroyed 2 helicopters. The following year, in South Korea, 100 Black soldiers attacked a local bar that had shifted its focus from Black soldiers to white soldiers. Korean villagers demanded compensation, carrying signs saying things like, go back to cotton fields. And at the 1st Cavalry Division's camp in the Central Highlands, RVN, a white first sergeant ordered a Black soldier into the field with his platoon. The soldier's response, you stop effing with us, rabbit. We're Black men and it don't matter. That afternoon, confronted by the troop commander, the soldier fired an automatic burst from his M16 at close range into the commander's head. A staff sergeant tried to cover the body with a poncho. Don't cover the rabbit up, the shooter shouted. All you rabbits take a good look. That's what we're going to do to all you rabbits. By 1972 in West Germany, officers and NCOs had begun refusing to enter barracks unless they were armed. Race is my problem, a white NCO told a reporter in West Germany. Not the Russians, not Vietnam. Race. Time magazine called this the war within the war. And in fact, there was less combat, much less conflict among men who were in combat in Vietnam. But the point is, to put it bluntly, the large majority of the US Army was not on the front lines in Vietnam. And during the Vietnam era, with 1.9 million people serving over the course of that period, racial conflict extended from fire bases in Vietnam to army posts within the states to installations in West Germany, Korea, Thailand, and Okinawa. And it spilled into the streets of the surrounding communities, both within the United States and beyond. That wasn't supposed to be the story. Many Americans, Black and white, civilian and in uniform, had seen the US military as a model of racial progress. Flawed, sure, but nonetheless a hope for the future. Here, a Time magazine story celebrates the US military as a potential model for civilian society. And the Army had really embraced that narrative. Platoon sergeant after platoon sergeant and senior commander after senior commander said, I see only one color, and that's OD, olive drab. NBC aired a documentary that endorsed that position in 1967. The Vietnam War was the first war fought from the beginning with a purposefully racially integrated army. And the result? Same mud, same blood. Soldiers transcended race. They showed footage of one white soldier from Chicago telling the reporter, you look over there and say, well, that man's picking up a shovel. You don't say that Black man's picking up a shovel. Transcending race. In that vision, in that version, the United States was fielding a colorblind army. But increasingly, from 1968 on, Black soldiers were making clear that that wasn't true. Of course, the problem of race, the prejudices and discrimination that created racial tension in the Army was not at all new at that moment in time. And I could spend a whole talk on that history. But in the months and years following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Black enlisted men, and it was almost always men here, along with some NCOs and officers, were beginning to challenge the Army status quo. Some offered what was thoughtful analysis and very carefully considered solutions. Some offered little more than rage and violence. Most fell somewhere in the middle. But in various ways, they demanded attention to their status as Black men and to the problems they were facing within the US Army. They objected to racist graffiti. They refused to tolerate being called boy and to the casual use of racial epithets. They complained about unfairness in the military justice system. They pointed out how very few Black officers there were. They challenged the status quo. And the result was often explosive, in part because there were so many angry and unwilling draftees, men of all races, who had little investment in the institution of the Army. At the same time, Cold War tensions were escalating. The situation in the Middle East was increasingly unstable. The war in Vietnam was failing. military leaders were facing a dangerous and volatile strategic environment, and some of them, some top military leaders, came to believe that the growing racial crisis threatened the Army's ability to defend the nation. And some of them, some top military leaders, believed that if racial conflict undermined the institution's very reason for being, it had become a problem they had to address. Sure, some of these leaders believed that racial justice was important. Some of them were motivated by a sense of that it was a moral or an ethical issue. But the intensity of the focus was because racial conflict seemed to threaten the institution's fundamental mission of national defense. Okay, so for the rest of the time, I'm going to talk about how the Army as an institution tried to combat what its leaders called the problem of race. But first, why does that matter? For those of you who are more operationally minded, it's likely a side note. Perhaps it sheds some light on the struggling Army of the late Vietnam era and what had to be rebuilt in the years following. Maybe it gives a sense for what else demanded attention of Army officers and leaders as they fought a difficult war. For those who are interested particularly in the history of the US Army, it matters because racial conflict was a critical piece of the difficulties Army leaders had to face and overcome during the Vietnam era, and it's a significant piece of the history of the US Army as an institution. But more broadly, for us as citizens of the nation or the world, I'm arguing that we have to think more about institutions and social change. In most cases, change comes from the struggles of the people who are seeking change. But in the end, that's not sufficient. For change to make a real difference, for change to make to matter, it has to be integrated into society's key institutions. And here, the vast institution of the US Army is an institution where that matters. So I'm arguing here that opportunities for change and the limits on them are determined to a large extent by the ways that an institution defines its basic mission and purpose, by the regulations and practices and procedures that govern its actions, and by how it understands its own culture and history, and some by a kind of institutional logic. And the US Army's institutional logic made the problem of race unavoidable in the Vietnam era because leaders believed that racial conflict threatened its ability to fulfill its mission. The institutional logic shaped how the Army defined the problem, how it tried to deal with the problem, and it shaped what solutions were more or less likely to work. So today, what I'm asking is for you to think through that claim with me. How does the massive institution of the US Army in the Vietnam era attempt to deal with the problem of race? Okay, so as Army leaders came to argue that because racial conflict threatened the institution's very reason for being, the problem of race demanded immediate attention, they made two key moves. First, in 1969, both the Secretary and the Chief of the Army made clear that race was the Army's central concern, second only to the US war in Vietnam. Next, and strikingly, the Army officially abandoned its claims of colorblindness and adopted a positive race-conscious approach. In 1969, Secretary of the Army Stanley Reeser made a path-breaking speech to the AUSA, the Association of the US Army. He said, "Some leaders will say with the best of intentions, for me, there's only one color, and that's OD. Yes, of course," he said, "to the extent of treating everybody fairly, that's true. But, quote, putting Black and white citizens in green uniforms, end quote, doesn't mean that their experiences, their different backgrounds, and their outlooks can be ignored." He said, "A Negro in uniform does not cease to be a Negro and become a soldier. Instead, he becomes a Negro soldier." Now, just a brief historical note, the use of the term Negro then was equivalent to the term African American now. So the Secretary of the Army claimed that in addition to combating racism, a negative force, the Army needed to define racial identity as a potentially positive force, or at least one that had to be acknowledged. Big claim. But how does it work? What happened? The Army, as an institution, Army senior leaders made a whole long list of efforts to solve the problem of race. And I'm only going to talk about one of them tonight, leadership and command responsibility. But in many ways, their initial impulse was something one might compare to throwing pasta against the wall to see what sticks. They tried a lot of things. They abandoned many of them. Still, as the institutional Army began its struggle to solve the problem of race, it had specific and powerful tools it could bring to bear. This was an institution that was built on principles of command, of rank hierarchy, and of obedience. When superiors issued orders, subordinates were required to obey them. As the Army created specific and detailed regulations, its members were required to follow them. Failure to do so had consequences. Nothing in civilian society compared to the power or reach of military command. Soldiers belonged to the Army 24 hours a day. The possibilities were striking. A commander who was intent on solving the problem of race might not change hearts and minds, but he, and in this case it was almost always he, certainly could change behavior. Given that authority, it's not surprising that Army leaders looked to leadership and command responsibility for solutions. The centrality of command was an essential piece of the Army's institutional logic and organizational practice. But as Army leaders struggled with their racial crisis, some started to realize that Army structures of command, for all their utility, were not an unmixed blessing. First and most basically, commanders, whether they led a platoon or a brigade, were human. They were products of a society divided by race, and a great majority of them were white. Anyone with significant authority in the Army at the cusp of the 1970s had come of age before Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus, before brave teenagers had integrated Little Rock High School, before 4 college students sat down at the segregated Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, before 250,000 Americans came together in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Those few senior leaders who were Black had risen in rank through talent and ability, but part of that ability was to navigate a white-dominated institution. By the end of the 1960s, some white officers wholly supported racial justice, others not so much. But even those well into positive territory were shaped by their upbringing, and it's difficult not to be shocked today by some relatively common blind spots and insensitivities. But in more concrete terms, here's what happened. In 1971, General Michael S. Davison was assigned to head the U.S. Army Europe with the mission of causing the racial crisis after the enforced early retirement of his predecessor. And his Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel was Major General Frederick E. Davison, who had come from command of the 199th Light Infantry Brigade in Vietnam. 2 Generals Davison. They got called, predictably, Salt and Pepper. About 5 months after General Davison, Salt, took command, he scheduled a conference on race relations. Commanders from corps level on down were not required to attend, but he sort of expected they would. I mean, after all, he himself was planning to be there for the whole event. The 2 corps commanders showed up for Davison's speech, then they left. Otherwise, only the equal opportunity officers who were required to attend stayed for the rest of the conference. At that point, Davison said, quote, "It became clear to me that I really had to get that mule's attention. And the best way to do that is to, quote, hit him over the head a couple of times with a 2x4. Davison understood what his mandate was, and he was willing to use the tools at hand. So what did he do? Well, first of all, he relieved several usurer company and battalion commanders, those that he judged weren't taking race relations seriously enough, of their command. And then the Army as an institution institutionalized a broader version of such measures. In early 1972, the Army began to directly evaluate officers on their handling of race relations on the officer efficiency reports that largely determined an officer's future. The OER evaluation item gave these commanders incentives to perform. But this move, the decision to evaluate officers on how well they handled that key institutional problem, was totally congruent with Army practice. But as officers confronted this category of evaluation, at the same time they're confronting spreading racial disruption, they had to figure out what they were going to do. And many did something that challenged traditional Army logic. Here we go back to institutional tools. Okay, Army officers, of course, had authority over those below them on the chain of command. Sometimes that structure allowed leaders to circumvent or minimize the individual prejudices of subordinates. That was a plus. But the chain of command also offered a structural problem. Each step down the chain of command offered potential for things to go awry. After all, it's not the intention that matters, it's the implementation. And each step up the chain of command offered subordinates a chance to shift a narrative, to obscure a problem. There was rarely a reward for noting that the sky was falling, even if it were true. There was ample incentive to downplay the negative, to sidetrack complaints and minimize crises, just as there was an incentive to inflate body counts in combat or to exaggerate the success of a mission. Emerging Army wisdom declared that racial conflict stemmed from a, quote, failure to communicate. It was the 70s. And memo after memo located that failure, at least in part, in the chain of command. Senior commanders were out of touch with their men. They had relied too heavily on subordinates who had no incentive to admit that problems were beyond their capacity to solve or to pass along complaints, especially those that reflected poorly on themselves. Time and time again, commanders of Army posts, commanders of Army units were caught short, unaware of simmering tension until it exploded in violence. Okay, lots of words there. What happened? In West Germany, where racial conflict was a full-scale crisis, since the mid-1960s, the Pentagon had increasingly treated the 7th Army in Germany, a highly disciplined fighting force that was charged with holding the line against the Soviet invasion of Europe, as a reserve both of men and equipment for the U.S. war in Vietnam. There was little continuity of leadership, equipment for training was scarce, enlisted men lived in barracks one officer compared unfavorably to the Nuremberg Zoo. Troops were bored and frustrated, morale was poor, discipline was weak, violence, now common on post, was spilling into the neighboring towns and cities. Young Black enlisted men who come of age in an era of Black power, were ever more likely to seek solidarity with other Black troops, to demand to be heard, and for some to use violence when their demands were ignored or unmet. Local commanders overall had not figured out how to handle the growing crisis. So one May night in 1970, about 50 Black GIs gathered outside the headquarters of the building, the headquarters building of the 1st Infantry Division, and demanded to see the commander. A Black sergeant, speaking for the group, told the captain on duty that if they didn't get to meet with the commander, General Garth, there was going to be trouble. The captain was not sympathetic. He called General Garth, who after the conversation sent his inspector general and the unit chaplain, both majors, to hear the men's claims. The Black soldiers were not pleased. There was shouting. Some men walked out. But the group's leader, Sergeant Hobson, a man Garth's aide described as, quote, the Pied Piper, able to calm or incite his men at will, convinced most of them to return to the table. The meeting was still going on at 9 p.m. when someone tossed a hand grenade through the window of the mess hall. There were 20 men in there, enlisted and officers, white and Black, who'd gathered there after a softball game. 10 of them were injured. Someone found another grenade nearby, along with makeshift explosives, a burning broom with its handle in a truck's diesel tank, a Molotov cocktail not yet lit. A third grenade went off under an unoccupied tracked personnel carrier. The fragging did get General Garth to headquarters, where he was confronted by a furious Sergeant Hobson. Hobson told General Garth that if he'd just come down to meet with the soldiers, none of this would have happened. He raised his voice. He called his commanding officer incompetent. He threatened to report the problems of racism to the proper authorities. Shortly thereafter, Hobson was charged with attempted murder and conspiracy, identified as the ringleader of a group of Black militants who planned and carried out the fragging and the attempted arson. It turned out the sergeant had been a gang leader on Chicago's West Side, known by the street name Caveman. James Hobson had cycled through 31 foster homes in less than 7 years. He had slept on the streets since the age of 16, been convicted 43 separate times by the same Cook County Boys Court judge for theft, battery, burglary, and mob action. Now, if racial unrest was, as many white Army leaders hoped and believed, due to a few militant troublemakers, and not to the underlying conditions in which Black soldiers served, Hobson was the perfect example of the problem they faced. This fragging, however, was less about Black militancy than about a failure of leadership, and some came to see it as such at the time. Speaking to a journalist the following September, General Garth confessed that race problems had been, quote, the furthest thing from his mind when he took command of that march. Quote, I had just never given it a thought. Then bang, we had that hand grenade incident. Okay, that claim, if true, was indefensible. If Garth didn't realize that race relations were explosive in his command, he was badly out of touch with his men. If, on the other hand, he saw the problem but didn't take it seriously, that too was a failure of leadership. Now, he may well have been justified, according to best Army practice, to refuse the summons of a group of angry soldiers on that May night. In subsequent years, Army race relations advisors would conclude that meeting with aggrieved crowds in racially charged situations only lent legitimacy to such tactics. But sending out a couple of majors in his place was probably a bad move, and the Black soldiers certainly saw it as dismissive, and in many ways it was. But Garth's greatest leadership failure may have been in discounting Hobson's leadership. Yeah, Hobson had been abandoned at birth. He had grown up unwanted. He had joined a gang at the age of 15. In that gang, however, Hobson had made a group of ill-disciplined and violent young men see him as their leader. And by the age of 20, he had walked away from the vice lords, despite the physical threat entailed, when two young Catholic nuns had offered him a different path. Joining the military was his way out of Chicago. But given his record, it took a fair amount of influence to get him into the Army. The boys' court judge, who had sentenced him those 43 times, was one of his strongest supporters. He wrote to President Johnson on Hobson's behalf. And once in the Army, Hobson had volunteered for Vietnam, leaving behind a safe post as acting drill instructor at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. The former gang member had been awarded 2 Bronze Stars and the Vietnamese Cross for Gallantry. Chicago had welcomed him back from Vietnam in early 1970 with its Medal of Honor. Hobson, who had marched with Dr. King in Marquette Park in 1966, told Mayor Daley and the Chicago City Council about the, quote, racial problem in Vietnam. It's bad, he said. It's second only to the war. Now, 24-year-old Hobson was what was called a shake and bake sergeant, not a lifer. No one would mistake him for what people then called an Uncle Tom. His qualities of leadership long preceded his time in the Army, and he was not one to let things ride. So when he ended up in the worst of usurers' racial mess in the spring of 1970, Sergeant Hobson emerged as a leader. On that May night in question, he had been without question on the side of the men who massed outside headquarters. But he had accompanied them to headquarters in an attempt to prevent violence, not by undermining the men's claims, but by seeking change. Hobson had tried to make the general's aide understand that the situation was serious, that it might easily erupt, but all the white captain could hear was a Black man threatening violence. In the end, Hobson was acquitted of attempted murder and conspiracy, the most serious charges, convicted instead of disobedience and stripped of rank. Hobson's supporters in Chicago raised over $7,000, much of it through blood drives, to hire a civilian defense attorney for Hobson's trial. One supporter and friend, appearing as a character witness at his trial, carried a message from Mayor Daley to the court. Jim is a good boy, she quoted the Chicago mayor. I want him back in Chicago. I want to send the young man to college. I need him in the ghetto. No one had been killed in the hand grenade incident, but it sent tremors, in the words of one reporter, from Bremerhaven to Bavaria through the entirety of the 7th Army. In the 1st Division, General Garth made changes. Any commander who thinks he doesn't have a racial situation is a fool, he said. Moving forward from the attack, even as Sergeant Hobson remained incarcerated, Garth then made it his business to speak personally with every Black soldier in the division. Maybe he realized that relying on his aide's analysis of the initial situation hadn't served him well. Or perhaps, post-fragging, Garth heard some version of what another Black sergeant in the division told a reporter. Your commanders may have the best intentions in the world, but they don't come down the chain of command without getting balled up by bigots and rednecks all along the line. Stepping around the chain of command, of course, is not an unalloyed good. One of Garth's aides complained about a private interrupting General Garth's conversation to complain about the quality of his breakfast. He said that the general's first-hand attempt to solve the problem of communication didn't leave him enough time to leave the division. And perhaps more significantly, many of his subordinates believed that he had undercut their authority. Okay, over to Fort Carson, Colorado, which in 1970 was a challenging command, to say the least. It was full of many Vietnam returnees who were filling out their last weeks in service, and many of them cared very little about the Army or its rules. Race relations were bad, violence was commonplace, and after a particularly explosive discussion with a group of young Black enlisted men, the post commander set up a race relations council, something that had been emerging as a kind of ad hoc solution in various places. This was a small group of low-ranking enlisted men, elected by their peers in most places, who would have extraordinary access to the commander. At Fort Carson, they met with him every day. And in that role, they acted completely outside the chain of command. Now, this model, again, was not without problems. Some young members of the race council suddenly, at least in their minds, placed above all of those people who had been telling them what to do, given direct access to a two-star general, tended to push the boundaries. Guidelines insisted that communication should be frank and direct. White commanders sometimes hadn't bargained for what direct sounded like. The Washington Post described one young Black soldier calling his division commander a general an effing pig to his face. A report on the situation from Fort Carson noted that it had been necessary to, quote, accept the abrasiveness of some of the natural Black leaders as a very small price for their cooperation in a dynamic but volatile and delicate area of human relations. Okay, a commander might decide to tolerate what was partly the posturing of youth. But what of the charges that he had undermined the day-to-day authority of junior officers and NCOs? The new model solved one issue. Complaints no longer got lost on their way up the chain of command. But how does an institution built on obedience offer subordinates an alternate path? There was no good answer. The Deputy Commanding General of the U.S. Army Vietnam, Frank Mildren, was so appalled by the practice that he resorted to all caps in a letter to those under his command. He said, the advice, take your complaints through the chain of command, is as sound in the modern Army as it was in earlier times. Excuse me. But from Fort Carson, General Rogers offered a more practical endorsement. He said, a militant Black activist who served on the Racial Harmony Council had warned him of impending violence. And because of that warning, they'd been able to head off an attack that had been planned and was underway. So thus, Rogers argued in his report, the Race Council justified both its existence and its violation of the chain of command. And as a sort of an aside, here too, individuals made a difference. The leader of the Race Relations Council was a man named Darnell Summers. The man seated just past the general who has his hands in the air. Darnell Summers came to Fort Carson after having been incarcerated in the suburb of Detroit on charges of having shot a police officer in a protest before he was sent to serve in the Army in Vietnam. He was released from prison and sent to serve out the remainder of his time in Fort Carson. And Darnell Summers found support when he was elected to the Race Relations Council. He was very well educated and had been a civil rights leader in his own hometown. He found support from the Southern General DeWitt Smith, shown there in the picture. And Smith was so impressed with Summers that when Summers left, Smith gave him this signed photograph as a memento. What maybe even made more of a difference is that same day, General Smith wrote to the Chief of Staff of the Army, insisting that he must pay attention to the failures of the implementation of military justice, and that DeWitt Smith was holding him responsible for replying to him so he could report back to the members of the Race Relation Council at Fort Carson. This shows, to some extent, because it happened the same day, what a profound impact Darnell Summers made on General Smith. But Darnell Summers, who to this day remains an anti-war activist and lives in West Germany, cherishes this photograph from General Smith and said that this relationship created a relationship of trust and communication that made an enormous difference in the way he saw the world and the Army. Okay. In the end, it's worth noting that despite the fundamental violation of Army practice, the Race Relation Councils were still leadership-based solutions. At Fort Carson and elsewhere, commanders sought natural, quote, charismatic leaders among the young Black enlisted men. Recognizing the unofficial roles these young soldiers already held, commanders offered them standing in a form of authority. It might have been co-optation, but it came with the ear of the commanding general and a very un-Army ability to speak frankly. From the Army's perspective, though, the drawback was that these men weren't lifers. Army leaders faced a constant struggle to identify and cultivate the next natural leader, and the next, and the next. Okay, so in a period of racial crisis, Army leaders worked from the premise that commanders were responsible, that leadership was a solution. The Army further institutionalized that responsibility by making effective race relations an item on the OER. As a solution to the promise of race, the Army's focus on command was the most in keeping with Army tradition and practice. Endorsing command responsibility was neither bold nor disruptive. Nonetheless, in service of that most traditional principle, command responsibility, commanders were willing to challenge the fundamental Army principle and practice of observing the chain of command. Okay, to conclude. First of all, did it work? Yeah, it worked in that the problem that Army leaders had identified was instability. It was the threat to the Army's ability to fulfill its mission of national defense. Their goal was to stabilize the institution. They did. It worked. If the question is, did it bring about racial justice and equality? Well, obviously not completely. But it certainly did improve the situation of people of color in the U.S. Army. The Army institutionalized and bureaucratized its attention to race. They made it visible, and they enacted a whole series of reforms. Second question, though. Second point. As an institution, the Army is big on lessons learned. So what are they? What's the takeaway? Okay. My fundamental takeaway, first of all, institutional logic matters. Issues or groups that pose problems for the institution's mission tend to prompt a response. For all the discussion of addressing race, and despite the fact that some programs made limited attempts to focus on other groups, ranging from Hispanics and Native Americans to Appalachian whites, it always defaulted back to the Black-white conflict. In this framework, white enlisted men and officers got lots of attention. Various programs focused on ending white provocations of Black men and training white NCOs and junior officers to manage the issues of race. But responses focused most directly on the claims and actions of Black enlisted men, because that was the group that, at least in the eyes of key leaders, was disrupting the status quo and disrupting the institution's fundamental mission. For some, that disruption was a tactical action in the battle for change. Second, institutional logic. The weight of the organization, its culture, history, tradition, policy, and practice fundamentally defines how the institution will define the problem, what solutions it will try, and what problems it will encounter. But at the same time, institutions are not timeless. They don't exist outside of history. When leaders understand how institutional logic functions, they're better able to craft effective interventions, to anticipate and to manage the constraints that stem from that logic. And for those who are fighting for change, whether from within or from without, institutional logic still matters. Those who understand institutional logic can figure out how to convince institutional leaders that change is necessary for the institution's success. They can figure out what can be accomplished within the boundaries of institutional logic, and this is critical to understand. To figure out when that institutional logic makes change impossible, when they must reject and challenge that logic. Finally, an optimistic lesson. We talk a lot about institutional racism, and having spent a lot of time in the records of the U.S. Army during the Vietnam era, I can say without reservation that institutional racism existed and was widespread. Some see an acknowledgement that institutional racism exists as a suggestion that it all is structural, that individual acts matter little. And what my history reveals is that that's not true. In case after case, time after time, individuals mattered, for good or ill, of course, but often for good. And in many cases, it was their hard-won understanding of the institution in which they served that made their actions effective, that allowed the creativity that made a difference. So I'm going to end with that note of optimism, and I'm happy to do my best to answer any questions you may have. Thanks very much.
Okay, if folks would want to put their questions into the question and answer icon on the screen, I'll pass them to Dr. Bailey. Dr. Bailey, I want to talk. I interviewed a number of years ago an African-American retired brigadier who was a major in 1968 in Vietnam, trapped in the middle, accused of being an Oreo, if you remember that term, yes, by the black soldiers and not trusted by the whites. How did because obviously he's a quality individual, otherwise he would never made general officer. How did the quality black officers respond to the environment that they were working in?
Well, as you said, it was a largely impossible position. By and large, it became generational. And so black officers often had less sympathy with the demands of enlisted black men, especially when they veered to violence, than some of the white officers did. But what was interesting at that moment, in addition to people trying to figure out how the Army should confront the violent demands for change, is that they also, Army leaders began thinking a lot about the scarcity of good black leaders in the Army, and the importance of having leaders that looked like everyone who served. So there was a sudden interest in trying to figure out how the Army was failing to properly mentor junior black officers. There was a lot of interest in thinking about how to guarantee that the Army was not overlooking the talent of men like the one you're talking about, and figuring out what was going wrong as there were so few senior black officers. In 1967, I believe I was correct, there was not a single general officer in the Army who was black. That was increasingly understood to be a problem. So those people who were caught in the middle at that moment, men like the one you interviewed, had an immensely difficult challenge in front of them. And I think the fact that he continued on to have the career he did shows how immensely talented he must have been.
Come on, folks, somebody's got to have more questions than me. How did the other ethnic groups, Hispanics, because you saw an increasing number of Hispanics being drafted during the Vietnam era, and what was their reaction? Or were they perceived as being white back then?
Well, the Army there's a really interesting book called Divisions, which is about World War II and how the military contended with the categories of race and created categories of race. And so Hispanics were classified as white often. But there was a rising level of consciousness of identity during this period. And so Native Americans, Hispanics, People from a whole variety of racial and ethnic groups were increasingly aware of their racial or ethnic identity and the struggles that historically their families and ancestors had gone through. But as I said, they tended not to be perceived by senior Army leadership as a threat to the mission of the Army. They were not demanding change in the same level. They didn't make up as higher percentage either. And so for all of the talk about how important it is to acknowledge the different racial backgrounds and the composition of the military, it was really only the black and white conflict that mattered, and it was really Black soldiers who got the attention from senior leadership because they were perceived as a threat to the mission of the Army.
First question comes from Richard. He's asking, do you know what the racial balance in the enlisted ranks were at this time?
It was much more proportional to the population. It was about 12.5% African American in the Army, and it was very slightly less than that in the US population. Once the Army and once the US military moved to an all-volunteer force, the statistics changed dramatically. And it went by the late 1970s up to almost 30% of new accessions. So that was a dramatic change.
It's odd, though, that the numbers may have increased. It seems over time the numbers of African Americans in combat units has decreased.
Yes, that has definitely happened. In Vietnam, as probably many people listening know, the casualty rate for Black soldiers was disproportionately high early on in the first couple of years of the war, and leading to a lot of claims that this was an act of genocide against Black Americans. There was a conscious shift to have a lower percentage of Black soldiers serving in ground combat units in order to make sure that there wasn't a disproportionate rate of casualties. And by the end of the war, it was more or less proportional in terms of representation in the population, which is a cold way to talk about the deaths of young men. But in the all-volunteer force, increasingly, as the Army sold itself as a great opportunity, more and more Black men and women who joined didn't choose the combat arms. They chose fields that provided skills that were marketable in civilian society, and that's something that has contributed in some ways to still struggle to have a proportionate number of Black senior officers, because combat experience and command in combat arms has traditionally been an important piece of that set of decisions about who gets promoted up the ladder.
The next question is from Lee. He says, Dr. Bailey, did your research reveal a nexus of drug abuse and dysfunctional race relationships? From his perspective as a young platoon leader, he saw drug abuse by both white and Black soldiers fuel this crisis.
Yeah, it definitely, the racial crisis was one piece of a larger crisis of indiscipline and during this era, and drugs were certainly a piece of it. Drugs probably in some situations, and alcohol even more, exacerbated the racial tensions and the racial violence among young enlisted men. But it wasn't, it can be abstracted out as well, because the ways in which people who were trying to contend with these issues talked about it, they didn't usually say, yeah, this was because of drugs, or it was intimately related to drugs. That they treated them more as coexisting than as causal. But yeah, it's critically important to recognize the extensive use of drugs, not just marijuana, but heroin, and also the extensive abuse of alcohol during this period. It did exacerbate the situation.
This next question comes from Curtis. How supportive were politicians to the Army's efforts to confront its racial crisis?
Oh, what a great question. there's so many echoes today. So one of the things that Army leaders did that I think is fascinating is a program of training and education. And they implemented 6 hours of race relations education in basic training, which is pretty interesting because commanders in the field are saying that they're getting soldiers who aren't really properly trained for combat in Vietnam. And what they did is to take 6 hours away from other kinds of training and put it into race relations training. And the kind of training they did was heavily inflected by what was considered to be cutting edge in the early 1970s, which was encounter groups and sensitivity trainings, where they had people try to confront their underlying racism and their emotions about race in ways that was probably ultimately unproductive, because once something has been said, it's hard to walk away from that. And the unit that was functioning all right suddenly has people saying things that are racist and nasty, and then having to work together. It didn't necessarily work out so well. But the people who were in ranking positions in the Armed Forces Committee, by and large during this point, were Southern senators, many of them former, well, still segregationists probably, but states' rights senators and representatives, who were very upset about the ways in which the Army was acting in what today they might have referred to as a woke fashion, and complained bitterly about this. And in fact, the Defense Race Relations Institute, which the Department of Defense had set up in Florida, some congressional leaders basically got its first leader transferred out because they thought he was advancing too far along this method of trying to change attitudes and trying to make people confront the underlying factors that forced that prompted racial conflict in the Army. So Congress was constantly getting involved, sometimes to support. The Black Congressional Caucus was very much involved in supporting some of these efforts, and many astute young men wrote to representatives in Congress to ask their aid. But the Armed Forces Committee was a bastion of conservative Southern attitudes during much of this period as well.
Next question comes from Julie. So most of the prisoners at Long Binh Jail were Black, and the prison was very under-resourced, leading to the riots in '68. Were those trends across the board? Were most of the prisons in Army jails, or I would say DOD jails, Black, and were most of those prisons also under-resourced?
So anecdotally, the representation of Black soldiers was highly disproportionate in Army stockades and jails. But because the Army and because the Department of Defense in general was working toward becoming colorblind, the data about the race of servicemen and women had been removed from a lot of forms. And so as people started to make the charges that the jails and stockades were filled with Black prisoners and they were highly overrepresented given their percentage of service in the Army, they couldn't really make the case using numbers because those numbers weren't being kept. Yes, Long Binh Jail was under-resourced. People were confined in solitary, in highly inhumane conditions. It also was, in many cases, people who were incarcerated there were not incarcerated simply because they had, not saluted or refused to get a haircut, but because they had done things that were war crimes. And so there was a range of people in there. So it was not simply, it was a difficult place to be incarcerated. There were people there who were violent in their day-to-day lives and who fostered violence as well. So yes, Black soldiers were more likely to get Article 15s. They were more likely to be imprisoned awaiting trial. They were more likely to be court-martialed, but the specific data doesn't exist because they weren't keeping full records.
This question comes from one of our Navy brethren, David. David wants to know if this was he knows this was an Army-focused brief. But did the other services experience the same racial issues that you discuss? If so, did they take the same approach as the Army leadership or a different strategy to deal with the issues? And if so, were they more a greater success or a failure?
Yeah. So that's one of the real fundamental questions here. And I focused on the Army because that's what I study and because it's the largest service. But each of the services faced their own set of crises. The Air Force probably less than anybody else. The Navy, because people were often confined on ships together in very close quarters, perhaps had more racial violence than the Army did. The reason that I look only at one service, even as I pay attention to how they're looking over their shoulders at each other, is because I say that I'm interested in institutional logic. And I mean, I think anybody who's ever served would recognize and acknowledge that the Marines have a different institutional culture than the Army, which has a different institutional culture than the Navy. And so I really try to look at one versus the other. I have looked at a lot of records where the Department of Defense would ask for reports from the different services or from the secretaries, and would get quite different responses from, say, the Navy and from the Army. I know that as the Army experimented with allowing people to wear items of cultural significance, and for Black soldiers to wear afros, there was a lot of looking over their shoulder at what Admiral Zumwalt was allowing the Navy, and soldiers were complaining bitterly that they weren't treated as well as the sailors were. So people were looking over their shoulders. There was a lot of conversation. The Department of Defense was integrally involved, but everybody handled things differently. I think the Army probably invested a little more attention to this than the other services, but that may be because that's what I've been studying, and I've missed efforts that just didn't rise, didn't show up within the records in the Department of Defense I was looking at.
To satisfy Dave, who should I ask for Dave to talk to? Who's the Navy lead on this?
I don't know if anybody's working on this in the Navy right now. I mean, there should be someone. There probably is. If
Well, we'll figure it out for Dave.
Email me directly, I'll figure something out. I'll talk to some of my friends.
Dave, I'll pass you her email.
Yeah.
This next question is from Isaac, and it makes me feel bad because I don't know when the Congressional Black Caucus was actually established, but he wants to know, what role did the Black Congressional Caucus play in pushing for more equality in the armed forces during the Vietnam era? And what educational programs were enacted to teach the leadership about African Americans?
The Black Congressional Caucus was central in its efforts to draw attention to the problems of racism in the US military, and in proposing solutions and pushing for their implementation. And the introduction begins with, or not begins, but the introduction, toward the end of the introduction, contains a quote from Ron Dellums, who essentially says the Army is a massive institution, but it can change. And I end there as well with that quote, because it was such a powerful insistence on the part of leaders, including Dellums. The Congress would not recognize the hearing that they set up on racism in the US military, and so it was done in a kind of ad hoc fashion, but it did get a good deal of attention. I also paid a lot of attention to organizations like the NAACP, which was heavily involved, and a lot of behind the scenes cooperation with senior Army leaders. So while it was Army leaders working within the Army based on their perception of challenges within, they were working in a context often of pressure from other organizations and institutions, and much of civilian society that was insisting this was an issue that had to be dealt with as well.
We'll make this the last question, and it's a bit of praise. It's from Mo. When he thanks you for your presentation and research into this area. He was a Marine, second lieutenant in 1974, and he remembers the constant racial tension as a Marine Corps infantry platoon leader. And he looks forward to your book. But did he wants to know, did you see any evidence within the McNamara 100,000 One, what was their racial makeup, and did they get disproportionately incarcerated during the period of their service?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't have it in front of me. I believe it was about 40% African American. And when Army leaders talked about the problems of indiscipline, they often pointed to Project 100,000, even though there wasn't any direct evidence that they were more likely to cause problems of indiscipline within the ranks. But that was one of the places that they went first for an explanation. It also played a role as the Army leaders began talking about process of affirmative action. And by affirmative action, they meant many affirmative actions to try to identify and support potential Black service members and officers because of the belief that Project 100,000 was almost all Black, and because of the belief that members of Project 100,000 had caused problems, that sort of hesitancy was often discussed in terms of officers, even though it had nothing to do with the officer corps. I do talk about all of that in the book. Most of the questions that people have asked me, I do deal with in some depth in the book, and I have stories about people trying to confront those problems. So I'm making a shameless pitch. Buy the book. It's fun.
Where can they get the book? Is it on Amazon? Yes.
Yeah, it's on Amazon.
Okay.
It's on Amazon, and I always like supporting local bookstores. So I appreciate it if people ask their local bookstore to order it, but definitely on Amazon. For those people who served, I love hearing from people who tell me whether I got it right or not. So that's an invitation.
Dr. Bailey, oops, we're getting something else popping up on my screen here. Okay. Thanks for coming back again. Appreciate your willingness to spend some time here this evening with us and give us something that really does echo today as the Army tries to work through other, maybe not racial issues, but more sexual and societal issues. So thanks, and we look forward maybe to getting you when your next book back gets out, getting you back here. Next week, we're gonna, not next week, on May 10th, I invite you back. Well, I should say, do you have any closing comments, Dr. Bailey?
Just thanks to you, and thanks to those who were here as an audience. I'm sorry I can't see your faces, but I really, it was a pleasure to have this chance.
Come on back in 2 weeks. We're going to try to make sense of a war that sometimes for the American public did make not a lot of sense. It's the war in Afghanistan. I've asked Dr. Carter Mackelson to come talk to us and really give us a cohesive view, because the war in Afghanistan seemed to pop up into the headlines and then disappear. So look at the entire scope of that war, from our introduction of troops early after 9/11, and then the withdrawal that took place about a year and a half ago, and try to make sense of the whole war, because quite often it was fragmented either geographically or by time. So please come back again May 10th at 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time. So again, Dr. Bailey, thanks. I'll give you a holler here in the next day or so, and again, appreciate again coming in this evening. Good night, everybody.